So a lot has been happening in the YouTube community recently, along with in real life. And by a lot, I mean a lot of really shitty things. Several YouTubers accused of abuse, including Alex Day, Luke Connard, and Sam Pepper, have made or are planning to make returns to YouTube. This is not okay. So let's go over the basics. What is sexual abuse and what is rape? The popular conception of sexual abuse and rape is, for example, being groped or catcalled by a stranger or being assaulted in an alley. However, this is an incredibly false conception. In fact, according to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, or RAINN, 93% of juvenile sexual abuse victims know their attacker. 34.2% of attackers are family members or partners, and 58.7% are acquaintances, which leaves 7% of attackers as strangers. But how does sexual abuse or rape within a consensual relationship take place? Well, according to Pandora's Project, sexual abuse is any sort of non-consensual sexual contact. Sexual abuse can happen to men or women of any age. Sexual abuse by a partner or intimate can include derogatory name-calling, refusal to use contraception, deliberately causing unwanted physical pain during sex, deliberately passing on sexual diseases or infections, and using objects, toys, or other items without consent to cause pain or humiliation. Basically, sex minus consent equals rape/sexual assault. Now, consent, what does that mean? People often understand consent as no means no, which is good, but it's a lot more than that. Consent is not the absence of no. Consent is an enthusiastic yes. No means no. What no doesn't mean is convince me, and silence does not mean yes. Consent cannot be given while you are mentally or physically incapacitated. So while you're drunk or having a mental breakdown, you can't give consent to your partner. From an entirely legal standpoint, consent cannot be given at any time when you are under 18. So, from an entirely legal standpoint, if you are an adult, aka 18 or over, and you have sex with a minor, no matter how enthusiastically they respond, you are technically a statutory rapist. Sexual abuse and rape in the United States and everywhere really is a huge problem. Someone in the United States is raped every 2 minutes, and most of these victims are women. 1/6 of women have been the victims of an attempted or completed rape in her lifetime. And the most vulnerable of women are girls aged 16 to 19, as they, well, we, are 4 times more likely than the general public to be victims. So obviously sexual abuse is a huge problem, but there's another kind of abuse that has occurred within the YouTube community as well as in real life that is less talked about but is equally as important. And that type of abuse is emotional abuse. According to the University of Illinois Counseling Center, emotional abuse is any kind of abuse that is emotional rather than physical in nature, which should go without saying. It can include anything from verbal abuse and constant criticism to more subtle tactics such as intimidation, manipulation, and refusal to ever be pleased. Emotional abuse is like brainwashing in that it systematically wears away at the victim's self-confidence, sense of self-worth, trust in their own perceptions, and self-concept. Whether it is done by constant berating and belittling, by intimidation, or under the guise of guidance, teaching, or advice, the results are similar. Eventually, the recipient of the abuse loses all sense of self and remnants of personal value. Emotional abuse cuts to the very core of a person, creating scars that may be far deeper and more lasting than physical ones. According to the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, 95% of emotional abusers are also physically abusive. However, because of the fact that there is very little research on emotional abuse, as it has only recently been studied, it is not criminalized. But this does not mean that it is unimportant or any less legitimate of a form of abuse than sexual or physical abuse. If we were to quantify crimes by the rate at which they are recognized by the American justice system, sexual abuse would not be considered a crime whatsoever, or would be considered a very minimal crime. Sexual abuse is one of the most underreported crimes, with only 40% of all rape cases being reported. So, why are emotional and sexual abuse so underreported if they are such a big problem? Well, first of all, only about 3% of rapists, 3% of literally millions of rapists both reported and unreported, will ever serve a day in prison. Second of all, we live in a culture that encourages victims of abuse to remain silent. And that is why silence, even as an onlooker, is not neutral and is never neutral. Anti-apartheid activist Desmond Tutu once said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor." Silence sends the message to abusers like Alex Day, like Luke Connard, like Sam Pepper, that their actions are okay, or that we are willing to overlook them for the sake of their content or their friendship, which obviously we are not, or we shouldn't be. The best way to help victims is to listen to them, to believe them no matter what, and to make sure that their voices are heard, but never to the point of their discomfort. The victim's comfort and safety is always a priority, and if the victim doesn't feel comfortable or safe coming forward about abuse, that's their prerogative. Victims of abuse who come forward about their abuse are incredibly brave. I can't even begin to express my admiration for the people who have come forward on Tumblr and talked about these really influential men, knowing that they will be ostracized by a lot of the YouTube community for coming forward about their abuse and doing it anyway. So yeah, like I said, silence is never neutral, so that means discussion is vital to preventing abuse. Some people say that discussing and spreading awareness of abuse is gossip or trash talk, which is not true. Silence is never neutral, which means that discussion is vital to preventing abuse. Discussing and spreading awareness of abuse is not gossip, and it's not trash talk. And in my opinion, calling the spreading of abuse gossip trivializes abuse. Gossip is something like, "Oh my god, I heard that so-and-so slept with so-and-so." Trash talking is like bashing somebody for no reason whatsoever, like, "Oh my god, she is such a slut." Obviously, neither of these things are okay, but they are not the same thing as discussing abuse. Abuse is not a topic of gossip, and calling someone an abuser is not trash talking them. Spreading information about these cases of abuse so that nobody else is abused or hurt is really vital and important, both online and off. Education and awareness of these things are vital. That's why blogs like YouCoalition and YouTube Speaks, which I help run, hi everyone, that's why those blogs and everybody on Tumblr who helps to foster discussion are vital, because education and awareness of these things are vital to prevention and vital to recovery. So that's why, to close this video up, I'm taking the YouCoalition pledge, because I feel that protecting people from abuse and supporting victims of abuse is incredibly important, both online and off. I pledge that I will always prioritize consent. I understand that consent is the presence of an enthusiastic yes rather than the absence of a no, and that consent cannot be given when someone is asleep or physically or mentally incapacitated. I pledge that I will respect my partner's wishes and that I will not pressure them or coerce them into doing anything that makes them uncomfortable. I pledge to stand with survivors of sexual abuse or harassment by showing them compassion and respect. I pledge to never blame the victim for any abuse they've experienced. Sexual violence is never the victim's fault. I pledge to admit when I make mistakes and to apologize for my actions. When someone tells me that I've done something sexist, victim-blaming, or otherwise offensive, I pledge to be open to their words. I pledge to support conversations surrounding sexual abuse and harassment in a way that is respectful of my needs and the needs of those I am speaking with. Lastly, I pledge to create safer communities both online and off.